Welcome to The Elephant in the Org, presented by the Fearless People Experience. Do you know those things in the workplace that make work suck, but remain unchanged? Well, those are the elephants we're here to talk about. We believe that these topics can and should be addressed with common sense, courage, and compassion. We may not have all the answers, and we're definitely not always going to be right. But we're here to build a better people experience. We gotta start somewhere. Let's go.
Welcome back to the Elephant in the Org, everyone. I'm Danny Gluch, and I'm joined by my co-host, Cacha Dora.
Hello.
And Marion Anderson.
Good morning.
And today we have a special guest, Ben O'Mahony. Ben is the CEO and co-founder at JobsASI, on a mission to give recruiters superpowers with AI and dramatically improve the candidate experience. Ben has spent the last 5 years building data and machine learning platforms and products, and before that had a career in people and talent in high-growth startups. Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Delighted to have a chat. Looking forward to our topic.
Now, we need to say Ben also put in his bio that he was Time Magazine's Person of the Year in 2006, which I thought was an extremely bold claim.
Yeah,
Ben, what were you doing in 2006? What was so spectacular?
Well, it's a bit of a joke. It's a nice one to get a little bit of notice. But yeah, it's the Time Person of the Year 2006 was you. So technically, we're all Time's 2006 Person of the Year. So it's just nice, I think, to pat yourself on the back every so often and say, hey, yeah, I did win.
You know what? I'm putting that on my resume.
Although if I understand correctly, what you were actually doing in 2006 was getting pished on whiskey in Edinburgh. Am I right?
Yeah, it was indeed. Yeah, discovering the good stuff.
That's my boy.
Clearly, Time Magazine thought it was spectacular. They really ruined, right, by Time Magazine saying it's you, so everyone can now claim it, really muddles the water and sort of the statistics of the importance of that. And lo and behold, the elephant in the org today is the misleading nature of statistics and key performance indicators in HR and the people space. And you, with a background in data and machine learning, is such a great idea to come in and talk about sort of like, what are these assumptions that we've made or been led to make in the HR space, right? We are not data analysts for the most part. And we're just like, oh, someone trained me when I got on board. This is how we're using data. This is what we're measuring. And it's like, oh, wait, someone who knows about this stuff is telling us we're wrong. Maybe we should listen.
Yeah, well, I think, and we spoke about this on the sort of build up, but, I think that we often sort of say, oh, I'm not, about data. Actually, in the people and talent space, we're often really excellent at the sort of qualitative data. And that's actually what a lot of where we get our ideas from, where we get the sort of hunches for these things is speaking to lots of people within the org. You get a feeling for these trends that actually, when you come to look at them, are very difficult to get down into numerical data. So yeah, for me, I think what you'll find is a lot of people and talent people are very data driven, but they're going to be focused a bit more on the qualitative rather than the quantitative. And unfortunately, we tend to run our companies on quantitative data, so numbers, and sometimes we can get sort of bamboozled by that data. And
that's a great distinction. I think some of that's the background of who HR people tend to be very quantitative as opposed to qualitative as opposed to the quantitative data. They're so easy to mix up. But one of the things that you first mentioned to us was that averages can really, really make the data that we are pulling together nonsense. And I wanted to hear from you and Cacha and Marion after that on what is it about averages? Because average is average, right? That shows like a well balance. But what is it that we get wrong when we do averages?
Yeah, I mean, look, from my point of view, I think it's almost every metric that you see in the people space tends to be an average of some sort. And I'm sort of very influenced by the Good Grips design people. They talk around actually. When they design scissors and other utensils, and everyone designs for the sort of average user. And what they did was different was they were like, right, well, what are the extremes, and can we look at them? So they're thinking, right, the 25-year-old bodybuilder who can't their fingers are too big to put inside normal scissors, versus the 92-year-old grandmother who maybe is struggling with grip strength and those sorts of things. And actually, if you design something that works for both of the extremes, then the middle's covered. And I think it's the same, right? When we're thinking about average, we're just thinking about like, what's the average employee, and that's not actually that useful or interesting, and like there is no such thing as an average employee, right? But actually, what we want to be thinking about and looking at is the extremes of the data and how we can make decisions around that. A worked example might be, I think, around absenteeism, where actually, you might have an average absenteeism over the year of 5 days sick, or less, I don't know, or more. I'm not au fait with where the benchmark for this particular stat should be. But the reality is like you might actually have a small proportion of your workforce who are long-term sick, who are dramatically skewing that data. And actually, like that's something that is very misleading if you've got those scenarios, especially in a smaller company, when it's like likely that you don't have someone like that. And then if you do have someone like that, and you're doing the right thing and making sure that they can come back to work, when they're fit and healthy, actually that's skewing the rest of your data. And you might make decisions later on down the line that are, not representative of, not backed with evidence, because, you've got this skewed data.
So logical. It's funny because there's so many KPIs that feature within the people realm that are just inertia. Someone started measuring that in 19 Canteen and we've never questioned it, and we've just kept going with it. And actually, like, you're smart and you've stopped and went, that's BS. Like, why are we even looking at that? Doesn't make any sense. And we're all pretty smart people. So when we actually stop and think about it, we're like, God, what a pile of crap. And I've wasted so many hours trying, with all these awful formulas to, how to calculate attrition and all of that. And oh my God. So actually it makes sense. I think obviously with tech now, we're getting a lot better quality data but and we're learning how to leverage it, but we really need to think about it in a much more sophisticated way.
I'm with you, Marion, on that. I think also too what Ben was saying around the concept of averages not taking into account the things that the circumstances. Averages don't take into account circumstance. So if you're looking at certain averages and you've had like either like big world change, like thinking about absenteeism during 2020. Well, you had a COVID pandemic. So like you had these like really long leaves for some people, and then some people never took sick leave. So if you only looked at the average from a couple of years during that period, and you didn't take into account circumstances, your sick time or your leaves that you had, there was like this huge anomaly. It just looked really, really big for some reason. And I think there's a little bit of that logic aspect of it's not just a number. What is causing that causality of where your numbers are coming from? I think that's where like we're kind of in a unique place to kind of talk about this in the people space, because numbers are always going to be important, but the story that you build from them and the impact, like when anyone, either like the C-suite, any place that we're having this conversation, when they're like, well, why did this happen? Like, why is this average so low or so high? And it's like, well, maybe not look at the number for a second. Let's maybe like talk about the rest of it, because I think that that's kind of how you get there ultimately, right? It's not just this average.
Yeah, I think for me as well, it's like, like working in data for the last 5 years or so, like I've worked with teams of engineers and analysts, and what you find is that actually, we can come up with a number and we can come up with a defense of why we've got that formula, right? But the reality is that isn't that useful on its own. You do need the context from the business. You need the analysis that goes deeper. You need to look at the spread of these things. And, a lot of businesses, you maybe don't have enough volume of data to go too deep into this. So especially in the startup world, we're in this scenario often where we're like, right, can we have some data on this? and you're like, right, well, I could go away and manually do a lot of work, but like, what's the problem that we're trying to solve here? And actually more often than not, I think you do also have to have that understanding. And it's one of the things when I was looking for a role a year ago was like, right, actually, do the leadership team understand that that qualitative data is important as well, and you don't have to have a number for everything, but having something that's sort of a little bit more like, right, like this is how people are thinking about it. This is what I've surfaced from these conversations. Actually, and especially in a high growth startup, that can be like way more useful than actual numbers, especially if, like I said, we've aggregated them up into an average to the point where we've got rid of all the information that actually went into making that number, and now we just have a number, and is it going up or down? That's actually like that's it, right? That's what KPIs are often. Like it's like a massive dashboard, and some of the numbers are green and some of the numbers are red, and you're like, okay, cool, like more green than red, like I suppose business going right direction.
No, but I think that's what brings up the green and the red and the just numbers. That and I'll never get over that good grits with the scissors example of, again, if you're averaging everything out and not paying attention to both outliers, right? Like if you're designing scissors and only the elderly and like close to the average can use it, but the slightly above average hands and the 25-year-old weightlifter, like they're just not going to be able to use your scissors. And if we think of this on like what HR teams are doing, let's like manager effectiveness, which is like us just trying to come up with a number that is like, what are the vibes on your managers, right? What's that actual qualitative, like how are people really feeling about the managers? And what I want people to realize is that if you get again, like don't just come up with a number for a number's sake, but if you're able to say like, hey, for the most part, people are happy with their managers. We have some who just absolutely love them. And we have some who really are unhappy. How we can't just focus on the ones that are really great, and you can't do one outlier and the average. You have to do both, or you're really gonna miss something. You're gonna miss something important, and it's going to affect the overall manager effectiveness of the organization if you don't address both, right? Boost up the great ones and address the poor ones, not just aim for the average.
That's a perfect example, right? Of like, I think we naturally do this, right? We look at the underperform, the peak performers and the real underperformers. That's something we naturally do, right? But then like turning those into metrics would be really interesting. So actually have like, I've used like tools like Peakon for like measuring internal engagement. Other tools are available, but yeah. Basically, right, do you want to look at, right, we want less than 10% of our managers to get a manager score of below X, so rather than being like, okay, we want to move the average up, you're saying, actually, no, I want to remove the bottom. And that's two very different approaches, because you can make the average up by making your best better. You can do it by training everyone and moving everyone up a little bit, or you can make it better by potentially putting on a pip or even moving out the people at the bottom end of the spectrum. These are all different ways of moving that average. But if you have those different treatments for all of them, so maybe you say, actually, let's flip that round. I want a positive. I want at least 20% of our managers to have an employee net promoter score of 50 plus. You can then say, right, okay, cool, like it starts to lead into that strategy a lot more of like, okay, cool, what do we think about these things? Do we want to like double down on our winners? Do we want to potentially cut our losers? Like what, like, do we want to flip that and do that? And you can have different KPIs that you're thinking about, or, in engineering, they're more like service level agreements, where you've got that, what service level of management do you want in your organization? And actually you can move those over time and see where they are. So you have a little bit of a better understanding of like, what's the distribution of management, not just what the average manager is like, because like we said, there's no such thing.
And I think that makes a great transition to, so often in business, we only get data to sort of like justify decisions that have been made, right? To show like, oh, and that's why we did it. The data backs it up. And like, you can even massage those a little bit and ignore some and do others to like really prove like, yeah, we're supported by data to do what we just did on instinct. And what you're showing is this really alternative solution where you can just be curious. You can get the numbers just because you're curious about the numbers. And then after you see the numbers, you can say, well, here are the different strategies we can do. We can get rid of the bottom, and that by its nature will shift. We can do all these other number of things. This is just what the data is telling us. How do we want to address the reality that the data is showing us? And I think that using it as a way to have discussions about choosing strategy and like how are we going to embody this philosophy that goes with our management philosophy, our organizational philosophy, that is so different than I think a lot of people who aren't used to data can do. And thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's really going to empower a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely right. Because that's the thing. If your strategy is one of those, right? Let's say, for argument, because I don't want to talk about the negative. Let's say it's doubling down on your winners. Can you move more people into there, right? You know, as a HR leader, you might say, okay, cool. Like we have this cohort of managers who their teams love them, right? And they're doing good work by some other hopefully objective metric, but unlikely potentially. Right. Can we get them to do some sort of mentoring? Can we bring more people into that group? And then you've got that, if you've got that measurement there of like, right, this is the benchmark for what we think is good. You know, I don't know what the net, like if you're using a net promoter score or a score out of 10 or whatever it ends up being in a survey. Right, can we get our managers to that? You can show then, because you've isolated it down to the treatment as well, that you're moving that number. You're saying, right, we're going to try and move more managers into the 8.6 out of 10 and above bracket. We've currently got 10%. Can we make it 20%? And what are we going to do to do that? And if you move more people into that area, you can say, hey, look, we're doing that, as opposed to it just being the average moving up and it less tied to. And I think this is another thing we spoke about in the beginning, is like how difficult it is to tie back metrics to like business goals and metrics. And this is the thing, it's like if you can then follow that thread through, like I said, if you've got some way of linking, say for example, again to make it simple, this manager is in the sales org, so sales is classically a place where you can just put a dollar amount on performance, and if you can tie that back to sort of, right, okay, here you go, this is the manager, top 10% manager in sales, this is their performance, and we're linking that back to value. Now you're like, okay, cool. Now if we go and take this sort of coaching agenda, and we want to take these top 10% managers and ask them to coach and bring up some of the other managers, you can say, hey, look, here's why. Because this top 10% of people who report into these managers, they are now producing more revenue for the company. You can tie that back and you can start weaving that thread of like, oh, this is actually like one of our most critical things that we could do. And kind of people know that people are incredibly important in business.
Yeah.
But like they tend to forget it unless you can boil it down to like a number. And that's the problem that we face constantly, I find, is it's just getting it to that point.
Well, on that very point about numbers, because sharing kind of personal anecdotes over the years, but unless you're in a progressive organization and trained really well, in my experience, when you enter a company, there's an expectation that you know how to measure all of these things and know how to apply them. And I think many HR people would agree that they learned on the fly from someone else who learned from someone else who learned from someone else, which quite frankly brings a lot of anxiety, right? And I think that that's shifting now, because we're actually able to get our hands on data that makes sense and isn't just some random equation that someone taught us to work out attrition like 45 years ago. It can inform better those conversations that you're having with other business leaders, particularly ones that are numbers driven, like your CFO, your CRO. I think though, we talk a lot about psychological safety, right? And speaking quite frankly, from my position, there's nothing more terrifying and unpsychologically safe than being in an SLT or a board meeting and talking about numbers, whatever those KPIs are, to a room full of your peers or your bosses or your board. And there's really no, yes, there's a logic to it to a point, but it actually doesn't tell you anything. And there's such a mismatch, between the understanding of the qualitative led CPO, quite frankly, right, versus everyone else in the room who's pretty much leaning into quants. I can think of how many times I've been in those situations and there's like cold sweat dripping down my back because it's absolutely petrifying. So I think I am such an advocate for what we're talking about today and where we're at, because we need to use data that makes sense. We need to stop using antiquated, numbers that actually mean nothing, that tell us nothing. Going back to an earlier point, is really just arse covering, right? What's your take on how to build the notion of psychological safety into this, Ben? I mean, your product that you're developing, on the and I'm thinking on the recruiter side rather than the candidate side, how do you think we can do better at having data that then supports really psychologically safe conversations amongst leadership teams?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so that's $1 million question, right? There's a lot there. I think, for me, I always think of like curiosity as like that route, right? It's like, and I don't think the boardroom is necessarily the time for that curiosity to be flushed out. It sometimes, unfortunately, is, but that's the thing, right? I like, so I don't think board meetings should be run in like a very incredibly linear way and like, oh, here are the numbers, they're all good, tick box, right? That's not what they're there for. They are there to challenge and to see if you know the data. However, like the level of sophistication that we can do in our day-to-day jobs, often because of the platforms that we use and the lack of prioritization on building people tech, and to be fair, like you said, the worries around really using quantitative data around what is, about people, which really, can backfire if that's all you look at, which is why it's very important that people are like understand the qualitative. It's like, we know why sick days are going up because such and such is having a horrible time with XYZ, and that's expected, and it's not actually changed the whole organization. We've just got one person or several people going through a really tough time, and we're supporting them through that. So it's about having that sort of that curiosity beforehand, where you go through and not this sort of rote, like you said, looking at those numbers and that sort of thing. And I think for me, if you get the leadership team like bought in on those bits, and like you said, you do that sort of that starting, it doesn't have to be well worked through, but that starting of linking that golden thread through talking about what we instinctively, because we've seen it, right? People don't leave good managers. People who stay get better, do better jobs. Then we know these things. Like they tend to be true. Obviously, there's exceptions, but we know these things happen. Tying that to like real value in or like even if you're just drawing a line yourself, that's where we start changing that narrative, and that's where you get the leadership team like curious and not sort of, hey, tell me the answer to this, tell me the answer to that, tell me the answer to this, tell me the answer to that, and you get a bit of a better dialogue going on. That's my rambling answer.
I truly believe that this is a gateway to help improve the relationship between heads of people with the rest of the leadership team, if the relationship's not great. And I don't mean personally, I mean based on, quite frankly, the baggage that comes with the title of HR. People have preconceived notions, and sadly sometimes they're right. And we do have a responsibility to be much more informed and accurate on the advice and strategy that we're providing, and qualitative and quantitative data backs that up. So I think the more tools we have like this at our disposal, and then the ability to have those really good conversations, like really informed, detail oriented, business savvy conversations that inform the rest of the business, it's only going to help improve us and the services that we offer, and ultimately the business and employee experience.
Yeah, Marion, I'm glad you said that before I chimed in, because I think it really, it's even also the just the general employee experience.
Yeah.
Right? If you're able to be like, have the transparency of, you obviously have to make a lot of this anonymous, but like, here's the curve, here's where people are, these are the data.
Yeah.
And we're deciding to take this action or enact this new policy in hopes of affecting this. Like, we're looking to get rid of the bottom 10% through pips and upskilling and maybe a reorg. Like, they can actually share some of that thoughts. Because I think one of the parts that a thread I've seen over the last couple of years in the burnout and the not feeling of stability and psychological safety for normal employees is the just sheer randomness it feels for big decisions from leadership that affect their day-to-day life and their stability as like humans on the planet.
Well, like well, and we've seen, how many times have we seen, like, I'm just thinking of like the sheer volume of LinkedIn articles over the last few years around the craving of transparency, right? And data is a great tool to actually explain things in a way that makes sense for people who are right or left brained, right? Because we have these different options when it comes to how we spin the tale, weave the yarn, however you want to say it. But like, I think that when you have that lack of transparency in an organization, regardless if it's top down all the way through, only at the bottom levels, but everyone at the top understands what's going on, wherever that breakdown happens, people, you see it all the time, right? Simon Sinek is like made a career out of talking about why people need to know the why. They need to understand these things. And I think that the data can talk to you about that. It can help. It can make people, like Marion was talking, feel more comfortable in typically pretty knuckled relationships when you can find a way to talk about it well. And to Danny's point, I fully agree. When you do not have a role in a company where you have a decision-making control aspect and you're just being told what's happening, that why component, that could potentially dictate what, we're talking about attrition, what your retention rates look like. If they're just seeing all these surreptitious decisions being made without actually truly having that understanding, the data could actually bolster that employer relationship.
Yeah, and I wanted to maybe bring this back because again, the HR people, the people space, we're really good on the qualitative data, right? If you want to talk to Danny about what are the vibes, I will give you very accurate vibe checks without really being able to tell you why, but just like, I read the rooms, yada yada, like, right? That's who we are. We're poker players. But like the old school poker players who can like read tells. But there's also this like new sort of, I don't know why I'm going into poker right now. Just where my brain went. Just let it go. Trust me. There's also this like new wave of poker players who are very quantitative, who understand all the probabilities and the odds and the situation and marry it all together. And I feel like that's where we need to go. And we're missing, as HR, as people who aren't like data scientists, I think we're still missing some of that quantitative stuff. And I wanted to lean back into some of your expertise on that, Ben. And what's your experience in sort of blending those two or taking a step more towards the quantitative that can be really useful?
Yeah, and I think it's a perfect example, right? Because poker is exactly, if you are only a bluffer or reading tells, or you're only knowing the statistics, like, you're missing half of the game. And that's the thing for me, right? Is like, that's where, certainly in my career, I've always sort of thought, rather be a what's the phrase? Like, not master of none. What's it?
Jack of all trades.
Jack of all trades, yeah. So yeah, for me, I think there's definitely benefit in learning some of these other skill sets and playing around with them and trying to understand more, especially within your organization, learning how people do their roles. It makes your understanding both quantitatively and qualitatively way better at understanding how to design that org or work with those people. Yeah, I mean, a couple of like acronyms for what we were talking about, which I always find funny, where they're like the HIPPOs, which is that highest paid person's opinion. That's something that happens. Obviously, worse than that is the zebra, which is like zero evidence but really arrogant. So, like, these are the kind of decision making things that we're trying to avoid, right? Where actually, if you can bring some sort of data to these sorts of things, then you really do stand a good chance. Now, I had an interesting one in my last role where I was talking about communication, and we had consistent problems with lack of communication. And the leadership team felt that they were communicating very well. And individually, not in public, but individually, I reached out to all the other leaders in the engineering org, and I just did a very quick, brief search on Slack, which was our primary communication, of public messages that my team could see about them. And the reality was that they had, or like several of them, not all of them, several of them had almost zero communication publicly. So there was, when they sort of came in and made decisions, and people were literally like, who is that person? I don't know who they are. What's their role? How do they do, these sorts of things. And it's very easy for us to be like, right, but I've been introduced to, done all the things, right? And actually just showing that stat to people, saying like, right, like, just to be clear, like, this is your footprint of, if I was to search for stuff that you've said, and like not have had a meeting with you, that's the only way I know you. And we were a very small organization, like 200, 300 people, right? So, at that point, it's like, actually, even data like that, you can make a real impact by sort of saying like, look, I'm not saying that this should be a key metric. In fact, someone who's always on Slack when they should be actually strategizing and leading is also a bad thing, right? So it's about this nuance of like, what's the right amount, but also clear, like, here, like, you think you're communicating effectively and you're very eloquent in person. Here's what one of my team members sees of what you've said, and it's not very much. So I can't point to any documents you've created. I can't point to this. I can't point to that. Like, that's fine. None of those things are what you have to do in your role. But given these things, you should be less surprised that people don't know who you are. Like, and actually, that was one of those things where it's just like, a couple of them got it. And we're like, oh, okay, right. So like, actually, while we are communicating effectively to our teams, what we're not doing is communicating to anyone outside of our direct orgs. And as always has to happen, you have to collaborate between orgs for things to get done effectively, no matter how perfect the org design is. And I don't think there is such a thing. Like, you have to communicate. And so showing that sort of mirror, I think, was really effective. And there's 100 other things like that you can do that should never be anywhere near a performance criteria for an exec, right? But it is an interesting, what's it called, anecdata, where it's like an anecdote but with a bit of a numerical number, right? You're like, hey,
I love that.
Anecdata.
I'm going to use that word going forward. Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
Consider that poached.
That's what this is for, right?
Sharing I hope everyone can take that, and I think that's where oh man, it's so, we're running out of time. These can't be 3-hour long episodes, because like little notes of that curiosity, right? That wasn't a standard, nor really, as you mentioned, should it be a standard measurement of performance or anything like that. But it's data you can search for just to be like, hey, you want people to feel like they're connected and related and in proximity with each other. Guess what? The way that our little forum is Slack. Why aren't you there? No one feels connected to you because you're not there. You have no presence.
Yeah.
You're not in the office because our office is called Slack.
Yeah. And how many surveys have been done around executive presence? A ton of them. And
I was just wondering, how can people in the people space do a better job calculating ROI? right? Because that's, well, when you're talking to CEOs and CFOs, CROs, like that's their bread. How can we butter it a little bit?
Yeah.
Ooh,
So
that
I mean,
sounds kinky.
sorry. Yeah. So I mean,
That's Danny.
My mom's listening.
there's there's one thing that does, like, it's very interesting having moved from people into data, is that one thing that does really sort of cut through that is that culture idea. And data people and people tend to want a very open, collaborative culture, and it makes sense, right? Because they both tend to be slightly to the outside of the main thrust of value. Unless you're literally building a product that is a data product, it's most likely your data team is more looking at, like, BI and some other bits and pieces that are trying to give you some insights in how you can do better, how you can market better, how you can sell better, how you can convert better, how you can retain better. Maybe you're looking at it, actually the org itself. So first thing I would say is, like, just make best friends with the head of data or whoever's in that arena, right? Because you have the same objectives. Like, they're really closely aligned.
And I think there are also some really same principles when you look at data and you look at HR. One of the things that, like, people get scared about HR is they want reality. Like, don't sugarcoat this. Like, we need to know what's really going on. And the data people are the same thing. They just want their numbers and to devise their whatever survey and the way they're gathering data to reflect reality as closely as possible. So I think there really is a natural connection there, like you were saying.
Absolutely. And, they'll help with ways of setting up your HR systems in ways that will allow you to, in the future, ask more questions of it. So, great examples would be, and this is really like low level stuff, some of it, but great examples are like no text fields, but more like categories. So you've got a drop down for, like, are they a regretted leaver or not? Like, because this is all of these things that are like quite annoying admin type setup things actually do have far reaching effects if they're worked on over time, right? Where you've got, like, if you think about, like, a great example is when people leave, do you have a structured way of capturing, like, why they've left? Are you seeing some themes from that, right? Like, if it's all written down or a transcribed interview, you can't really mine it for data in an easy way. You've done them, so it's in here, and, like, that's the qualitative stuff, right? You can say, everyone's talking about salary, like these, XYZ startups keep pinching our staff, like, because they keep offering bigger salaries, so we know that's the reason. But that's not, like, it's very difficult to say, to back that up with evidence if you don't do these things. But yeah, no, for sure, like, pairing with that data team and, like, working on that, like, can we get more data into people's hands, right? And, like, then when people start using it and seeing it, they also start to care about the data quality. When they start to see that it becomes something that the whole organization cares around, and it's something that's like, you start having these things, it's like, and probably not in people, because not that ethical to do A/B testing on pips or something like that. That would be ridiculous. But
I don't know, it'd be fun.
Sounds like something if you're in college, it's the excuse, right? I'm just in college, I have to test these things.
I'm thinking about the what's the Stanford experiment kind of thing, we're like, go give them this feedback, now give them some more feedback, now give them see how far they'll go if you just keep telling them to give this feedback. But no, like, bring it back to, like, having something like that where you're like, actually, you get that experimentation and curiosity throughout the organization. You tend to have more nuanced and interesting discussions. And also, what you do is you start to see, right, data goes from being that, like, I think there's a sort of, I always talk about that, the curve of sort of understanding, when it's like, when you get going, you're naive, and as everyone is in the beginning of their careers, and you're like, oh, I know this to be certain, this is true, right? And then that's like simplicity before complexity. Then you've got complexity and you wade in at the deep end. You're like, I don't know which way up or down. And, you can take years to really untangle some things. Funny enough, when you go through the complexity on the other side, you tend to have kind of similar opinions to you had at the beginning, where you're like, hey, yeah, like, high turnover is bad, right? Low experience scores are bad. Like, we want people to have a good time here, right? So it's the same opinions, but you understand the complexity there. And that's kind of that journey that not only, we as individuals go on and in every axis, but it's like the org as well. You need to guide it through that, where you're like, hey, like data is no longer necessarily God. And look, we've got this like, oh, we'll only do something if the numbers are right. Mm-hmm. You're like, hey, we know that the data on this is going to be a bit spotty. So we're comfortable using our experience combined with the data, and we're measuring it in a more nuanced way that says, like, rather than like we're seeing where the average goes and it's too noisy to actually do it, we've zeroed in on one thing. We're like, oh, we think we can move this lever. We think that that's going to have a positive impact because we've linked it to ROI in some way, because we're saying, like, look, this is where the high performers are. We've followed that chain and we found that they all have they love their managers, right? Okay, cool. So, okay, we've got some linkage going on here. It's not perfect, but we can kind of tell that story, and like everyone else passes the sniff test. People will say, yep, that kind of makes sense. Okay, cool. Like, can we make more people in this area? Okay, cool. We're doing that. And now we're measuring our improvement along that area, and we're putting in some strategies to do that. Then you're like, right, okay, cool. And you do that for a number of quarters, and like all of a sudden you have a much better leadership team conversations. And actually people are like, right, okay, cool. Like, this is what we're trying to do. Increase it. It's like, well, I'm a leader in this organization at this leadership team. Well, how do I make sure more of my people are in that top 10%? I want people to be, I want the people in my org to be very happy. How do I help on this journey? And you move it from like a people objective into a company objective, and then that becomes like really powerful for me. That's how I think about it.
I love that. I love that. And I just want to move us towards wrapping up. I love that you in that little answer specifically talked about it being a journey. And I want to give everyone who's new to this and who hopefully is excited by this, but maybe a little scared, that it's okay that it's a journey. You're not going to be great right away, right? You're still a rookie, or you're just getting a little bit better in data. And I also love that curiosity, right? Like, be curious about the full distribution, not just the average. What are the stories behind those, and how can you strategically then address that? Like, what's your actual strategy going to be in addressing this distribution of, am I going to focus on the outliers on the low end or the high end? Like, don't just be like, oh, well, we're going to make the average better. We're going to make it go up and to the right. But like, actually, how are you going to do that strategically? And the numbers can really give a lot of transparency and psychological safety and stability and predictability around those decisions and policies. And I love all of that. And I would like to go around the room. Ben, I'll let you choose. Do you want to go first or last?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, that really reminds me, like, again, like one of the best resources for this, like, kind of strategy framework is like Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. And it talks about like a diagnosis and then a prescription or treatment. And that's kind of that journey of going on those sort of things. But yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, I don't know. I've hijacked it again.
No. I was literally just looking for an amazing little nugget like that. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we go to Cacha and Marion to wrap up?
Oh, now you've put me on the spot. No,
okay, we'll let you go last. We'll let you go last. Cacha, what are some of your like final thoughts as we wrap up?
I'm thinking in this conversation, I've thought really heavily about what the experience looks like for people who aren't familiar with using data, right? We're so in that qualitative space that the quantitative seems like a really big mountain. And I think that there's so many amazing things that Ben has said to really, I think, help bring those fears down and help to continue to take a look at the big picture and start to isolate little things. And I think that as we in this space have that opportunity, we'll be able to tell better stories with data. I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Marion?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's that CPO relationship with the rest of the business and being able to find commonality and really work together on that qual and quant data and do good work, right? It's not a battle. It's not you against them. You're a team. You're doing it together. And the fact that data is here, and we can leverage it to make all of our lives easier and ultimately give the employee a better experience. I'm here for it.
Last thoughts, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Cacha, I really like what you said there around like taking away the sort of fear from it. And I think, there's a classic situation of like everyone thinks someone else has worked this out, and they haven't, and you can go and like the best thing for that for me, I find, is like meetups and events, and you go and you're like, oh, like, have you done this? And they're like, oh, no, we want to. We've been thinking about it. We've been talking about it. We've not got that, and you just realize, right, okay, cool. Like you don't have to have know-it-all to start the journey, and really there isn't an end. Like, there's just your career, right? So, like sometimes that growth, it looks like a brick wall in front of you, but that's actually when the growth curve is like at its highest and you're learning the most, when it looks like you have no idea of the way forward, but actually the way is up and you just need to just keep at it and break through. So yeah, like for me, it's about these little, these taking those baby steps and, soaking up that, like you said, becoming best friends with the head of data and soaking up everything that they do and, collaborating with them. And I think, you'll find that everyone's interested in the sort of insights that you can bring once you start going down that journey.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. This was an amazing conversation. I hope everyone feels just ready to go and measure everything. One thing I would like to measure is how many 5-star reviews we can get on iTunes and Spotify. Be sure to like, subscribe, leave a review. You can contact us at elephant@thefearlesspx.com. Remember, we have episodes posting every Wednesday. Anyways, thank you again, Ben. You guys can find him on LinkedIn. Check out JobsASI, and you'll see links and things in the show notes. See you next time, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Cheerio.
Thanks, Ben.